The small cabin sat at the edge of Willow Creek, its wooden walls weathered by 3 harsh winters. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a thin wisp against the pale morning sky. Inside, 12-year-old May stirred a pot of porridge, the only breakfast she would have today. The spoon scraped against the bottom of the pot, a sound that echoed through the empty cabin. May was alone now. Had been since the fever took both her ma and pa last winter. The sickness had swept through the settlement like wildfire, claiming 7 souls in all. The Miller family 2 cabins over lost their youngest boy. Old Mr. Peterson, who ran the trading post, died in his sleep. The Thompsons lost their grandmother, and May lost everyone who mattered. "You talk to yourself too much," May whispered, scolding herself for the dark thoughts. She spooned the bland porridge into a chipped bowl and sat at the rough-hewn table her pa had made when they first arrived in these parts 3 years ago. The settlement of Willow Creek wasn't much to look at in 1832. 20-some cabins, a trading post, a small church, and acres of cleared land where crops grew in neat rows during the growing season. Beyond that stretched miles of wilderness, thick forests and rolling hills that led to the great river, the natural boundary that separated settler land from native territory. May finished her breakfast and washed the bowl in a bucket of water she'd drawn from the well at dawn. Outside, the settlement was coming to life. Mrs. Thompson hung laundry while her 2 boys chased each other around the yard. Mr. Miller hitched his horse to a wagon loaded with furs, bound for the larger town 30 miles east. "Morning, May," called Mrs. Thompson, waving a damp sheet. "Got those shirts done yet?" "Yes, ma'am," May called back. "I'll bring them over before midday." Mending clothes was one way May kept herself fed. The settlement folks had been kind enough after her parents died. They brought food at first, offered to take her in, but May couldn't bear to leave the cabin, the last place she'd seen her parents alive, so they compromised. May would stay in her home and the settlers would provide odd jobs a 12-year-old girl could handle. She collected the stack of neatly mended shirts from the small table by the window. Her stitches were tiny and even, a skill her mother had taught her from the age of 6. "A woman who can sew has a trade," Ma used to say. "She'll never go hungry." May slipped into her faded blue dress and laced up her boots. They pinched her toes now. She'd grown since last spring when Mr. Peterson had given them to her in exchange for helping organize his shelves. She'd have to find something else soon, before winter came again. The morning air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as May walked the dirt path toward the Thompson place. Chickens scattered at her approach, and she spotted young Billy Thompson feeding corn to the family's milk cow. "Those look right nice," Mrs. Thompson said, examining May's stitchwork on her husband's torn shirts. "You've got your mother's touch, that's certain." She handed May 2 potatoes, an onion, and a small jar of preserved peaches. "This enough?" "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." May tucked the food into her basket. It would make a fine stew tonight, with the rabbit Mr. Carter had given her yesterday for sweeping his porch. "You know," Mrs. Thompson said, lowering her voice, "the Carters are still willing to take you in. They've got that spare room since their Jane married and moved away." May stared at her boots. "I'm doing fine on my own," Mrs. Thompson sighed. "A child your age shouldn't be living alone, especially not with winter coming. What if you get sick?" "What if I won't get sick?" May said firmly. "And I keep the cabin warm." The worry lines deepened around Mrs. Thompson's eyes, but she didn't press further. "Well, at least come for Sunday supper tomorrow. Pastor William says he hasn't seen you in church for 2 weeks now." May nodded, though she had no intention of going. The church reminded her too much of the day they buried her parents. The cold ground and the plain wooden crosses and Pastor Williams talking about God's mysterious ways. What was so mysterious about a fever that burned people from the inside out until they couldn't even recognize their own daughter? The rest of the morning passed with more chores. May swept the schoolhouse steps for Teacher Roberts, who paid her with a chunk of cheese and a slightly bruised apple. She carried water for old Mrs. Wilson, whose arthritis was too bad to manage the heavy buckets. By midday, May's basket held enough food for several meals, and her pocket jingled with 3 copper pennies from Mr. Miller, who needed help sorting his furs. Most girls her age would be in the schoolhouse now, learning their letters and numbers. May had gone for a while after her parents died, but the pitying looks from Teacher Roberts and the whispers from the other children drove her away. Besides, she could already read better than most grown settlers thanks to her mother's teachings. The small shelf in her cabin held 5 precious books, more wealth than many frontier families possessed. After dropping her food at home, May headed for the forest edge. This was her favorite part of any day, when chores were done and she could lose herself among the trees. The settlers didn't approve of her wandering alone, but they couldn't very well stop her. May knew the woods better than most grown men in Willow Creek. Her father had taught her to recognize animal tracks, to move quietly through underbrush to find her way by sun and stars. The forest welcomed her with cool shade and the sweet scent of wildflowers. May followed a narrow deer path that wound between tall oaks and slender birches. Squirrels chattered overhead, and somewhere a woodpecker drummed against a tree trunk. These sounds soothed something inside May that always felt ragged and raw. She reached her special place after a half-hour's walk, a small clearing beside a bubbling creek. An old oak tree had fallen here years ago, its massive trunk now a perfect bench. May sat and pulled a small leather pouch from her pocket. Inside was a smooth stone the color of honey, the last gift her father had given her. "Found this in the creek bed," he'd said, pressing it into her small hand. "Reminded me of your eyes when you laugh." May couldn't remember the last time she'd truly laughed. She ran her thumb over the stone's surface, worn smooth by years of rushing water. How long would it take, she wondered, for time to smooth away the jagged edges of her grief? A rustling in the bushes startled her from her thoughts. May tensed, reaching for the small knife she kept in her boot, another of her father's lessons. The wilderness held dangers, bears, wolves, mountain lions. But it was only a rabbit that emerged, its nose twitching as it tested the air. May relaxed, watching as the creature hopped to the creek's edge for a drink. In that moment, she felt a strange kinship with the wild thing, both of them alone, surviving by instinct and skill. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of light on the forest floor. May should head back soon. She needed to check her small garden behind the cabin, tend to the few vegetables that supplemented her meals. Then there was firewood to stack and water to draw for tomorrow. A life of endless chores, endless work just to keep living. Sometimes in the darkest hours of night, May wondered why she bothered. What was the point of struggling so hard just to wake up and struggle again? But then morning would come, bringing birdsong and sunrise and the smell of pine. And something inside her refused to give up. Her mother would have called it stubbornness. Her father would have called it strength. May didn't know what to call it, only that it kept her feet moving one step after another. She stood and tucked the stone back into its pouch. The settlement would be visible once she crested the next hill, its cleared land a scar in the endless green of the forest. Not home, not really, but the closest thing she had. As she walked, May noticed wild herbs growing beside the path, the ones her mother had taught her to use for medicine and cooking. She knelt and carefully gathered some, adding them to her basket. Tonight she would hang them to dry from the cabin rafters, filling the small space with their earthy scent, a small comfort in her solitary life. The path widened as it approached the edge of the settlement. May could hear children's voices carried on the breeze, playing some game in the dusty space between cabins. For a moment she remembered joining such games before the fever came, the laughter, the simple joy of belonging. She squared her shoulders and continued walking. That was another life, one that ended when they put her parents in the ground. This was her life now. The lone girl at the edge of civilization, caught between the settlement and the wilderness, belonging fully to neither, but she was surviving. And for today, that would have to be enough. May's basket swung gently at her side as she made her way along the riverbank. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the leaves overhead, and the rushing water of the great river sang its endless song. This far from the settlement, the world felt different, wilder, more alive somehow. She had come to gather herbs that grew best near water. The purple-flowered plant her mother had called river root was good for fevers, and May kept a small store of dried leaves in her cabin. With fall approaching, she needed to collect more before the first frost killed them back. The day was warm for late September, and May had rolled up her sleeves as she worked. Her skin had browned from months of outdoor work, making the small scar on her forearm stand out white against her tan. A reminder of the time she'd tried to help her pa skin a deer and slipped with the knife. He hadn't scolded her, just wrapped the cut and showed her how to hold the blade properly. "Pay attention to what you're doing, little one," he'd said. "The wilderness forgives no mistakes." May shook away the memory and knelt beside a patch of river root. The rich soil felt cool between her fingers as she carefully dug around the base of the plant, making sure to get the roots intact. Her basket already held wild onions, a handful of late berries, and some mint that grew in abundance along the water's edge. A snap of twigs from the thicket downstream made May freeze. These woods were home to black bears and the occasional mountain lion. She reached slowly for her knife, eyes fixed on the dense undergrowth where the sound had come from. The bushes rustled, and May held her breath, but it wasn't a bear that emerged from the foliage. It was a girl. May's eyes widened. The girl was perhaps 2 summers older than herself, with copper skin and long black hair bound in 2 braids. She wore a deerskin dress adorned with tiny beads that caught the sunlight, and soft leather moccasins rose to her knees. But what drew May's attention was the way she moved, limping badly, one hand braced against a tree trunk for support. The native girl spotted May at the same moment. She jerked back, nearly losing her balance, her free hand flying to a small knife at her waist. For a heartbeat, the 2 girls stared at each other across the clearing, both poised to flee or fight. May knew she should run. Every settler child was raised on warnings about crossing paths with the native people who lived beyond the river. There had been peace for many years, but recent disputes over hunting grounds had strained relations. Just last month, a trapper claimed he'd been chased off tribal lands where he'd been setting his snares. But the girl was hurt. May could see blood darkening the leather around her right ankle, and pain-etched lines around her mouth despite her wary expression. Slowly, May raised her empty hands, palms out. The universal sign of peace. The native girl's posture relaxed slightly, though her fingers remained near her knife. "Are you hurt?" May asked, pointing to the girl's ankle. The native girl frowned, clearly not understanding the words. She spoke a few phrases in her own language, musical sounds that meant nothing to May. May pointed again, this time to her own ankle, then made a face of pain and mimicked limping. Understanding dawned in the native girl's eyes. She nodded, gesturing to her injured foot and then pointing across the river, speaking more words May couldn't understand. The message seemed clear enough. She was hurt and needed to get to the other side of the river, back to her people. May bit her lip, considering. The nearest crossing was half a mile upstream, where the water ran shallow over a bed of stones. But even that crossing would be difficult for someone injured. Moving slowly, May set down her basket and approached. The native girl tensed again but didn't back away. When May was a few feet away, she pointed to herself. "May," she said clearly. The native girl hesitated, then touched her own chest. "Nika." A smile flickered across May's face. Names were a beginning. She mimed looking at Nika's ankle, raising her eyebrows in question. After a moment's consideration, Nika nodded and leaned against a nearby boulder, extending her injured leg. May knelt and gently examined the wound. A deep gash ran along the outside of Nika's ankle, crusted with dried blood. It looked like the kind of injury that came from a fall onto sharp rocks. Nika winced as May's fingers probed gently around the wound, but she made no sound. "Water," May said, pointing to the river. "Clean," she pantomimed, washing. Nika seemed to understand. She spoke a word that must have meant yes in her language and allowed May to help her hop to the river's edge. There, May tore a strip of cloth from the bottom of her petticoat and soaked it in the cool water. As she cleaned the wound, May noticed other details about the native girl. A small scar above her right eyebrow, calluses on her hands that spoke of work and skill, a necklace of polished stones that gleamed against her skin. Not so different from herself, really. The wound looked better once the dirt and dried blood were washed away. It was deep but clean, likely painful but not dangerous if infection didn't set in. May reached into her basket and pulled out some of the herbs she'd gathered. She crushed the river root leaves between her fingers and pointed questioningly to the wound. Nika studied the herb, then nodded. She said something and pointed to a similar plant growing a few yards away, then made a gesture of approval. The recognition gave May confidence. If Neka's people used the same plant for medicine, it must be the right choice. May made a paste of the crushed leaves and applied it to the wound, then bound it with another strip from her petticoat. Throughout the process, Neka remained stoic, though May could tell it hurt by the way she breathed. Short, controlled breaths when the pain was worst. When she finished, May sat back on her heels and smiled. Neka touched the bandage gently, then met May's eyes. She spoke a word. repeating it twice, and though May didn't know the language, the gratitude was unmistakable. Neka pointed across the river again, this time with greater urgency. She made a motion like the sun setting, then held up 4 fingers. It took May a moment to understand. Neka needed to be back with her people before sunset, and she'd been separated from them for 4 days. May looked at the position of the sun. Only a few hours of daylight remained. She glanced downstream toward the settlement, then back at Neka. The girl couldn't make it across the river alone, not with that injury. But helping meant crossing into tribal lands, something no settler child had done in living memory. Neka seemed to read the conflict in May's face. She spoke again, softer this time, and pointed to herself, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the forest on the far bank. Family, maybe, or home. May thought of her own empty cabin, the silence that greeted her each night. She thought of her parents who had taught her that courage meant doing what was right even when it was hard. What would they want her to do? The answer came with surprising clarity. They would help. They always had. May stood and offered her hand to Neka. "I'll help you cross," she said, knowing the words wouldn't be understood but hoping her intent was clear. She pointed to herself, then to Neka, then to the river and the forest beyond. Neka's eyes widened slightly. She searched May's face, perhaps looking for signs of deception. Finding none, she reached out and clasped May's offered hand. The gesture transcended their different languages, different worlds. In that moment, they were simply 2 girls alone in the wilderness, one hurt and one willing to help. May retrieved her basket, then returned to Neka's side. She positioned herself under Neka's arm, providing support for her injured side. Together, they took a tentative step. Neka winced but nodded that she could continue. Slowly, they began making their way upstream toward the crossing. The going was difficult over the uneven ground. Twice Neka stumbled, and May nearly buckled under her weight. But each time they recovered and pressed on. As they walked, May realized she was crossing a boundary far more significant than the river ahead. She was stepping away from the safety of everything familiar, guided by nothing but the belief that helping this girl was the right thing to do. The sound of the rushing water grew louder as they approached the crossing. Through a break in the trees, May could see the late afternoon sun glinting off the river's surface. The water looked cold and unforgiving. On the far bank, the forest stretched dense and mysterious, tribal lands where no settler was welcome. Yet, Neka's warm weight against her shoulder reminded May that borders drawn by adults didn't matter to a girl who just wanted to go home. And somehow that seemed like the simplest truth of all. The ford came into view as the sun dipped lower in the western sky. Here the great river spread wider and shallower, with smooth stones creating a natural pathway across the rushing water. In spring, when the snows melted in the distant mountains, this crossing disappeared entirely beneath the swollen river. But now in early autumn it was passable, though not without risk. May studied the water, her arm still supporting Neka's weight. The current looked stronger than usual. Recent rains upstream must have swelled the river. Normally, May would have turned back, waited for calmer waters. But the urgency in Neka's eyes when she pointed to the setting sun told her there was no time to wait. "We need to find you something to help you walk," May said, knowing Neka wouldn't understand the words but hoping her tone conveyed the meaning. She helped Neka sit on a fallen log near the riverbank, then searched the surrounding area. After a few minutes, she found what she was looking for, a sturdy branch from a young oak about as tall as her shoulder. Using her knife, she quickly trimmed away the smaller branches and tested its strength. It would do as a walking stick. Returning to Neka, May demonstrated how to use it, tucking it under her arm and taking a few exaggerated steps. Neka nodded, her dark eyes watching intently. When May handed her the makeshift crutch, Neka tested it carefully, putting her weight on it while keeping her injured foot raised slightly off the ground. A small smile of relief crossed her face. May pointed to the river, then to the far bank, raising her eyebrows in question. "Are you ready?" Neka glanced at the rushing water and May saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. But it was quickly replaced with determination. She nodded once firmly and gripped the walking stick tighter. The sun hung low now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They needed to cross before darkness fell. The thought of being caught on the wrong side of the river after nightfall sent a shiver down May's spine. But she pushed the fear aside. One step at a time, that's what her pa would have said. May removed her boots and tied them around her neck by the laces. The rocks would be slippery, and bare feet would grip better than leather soles. After a moment's hesitation, she removed her woolen stockings too and stuffed them into the boots. They were her only pair without holes, and she couldn't risk them getting soaked. Neka watched, then did the same with her moccasins, tucking them into a small pouch at her waist. She said something in her language and pointed to May's basket of herbs. May had almost forgotten her gathered treasures. She couldn't carry the basket and support Neka at the same time. For a moment she considered leaving it behind, but some of those herbs had taken hours to find and would be hard to replace before winter. Neka seemed to understand the dilemma. She spoke again and made a wrapping motion with her hands. May caught on. They could wrap the herbs in her apron to carry them. Working together, they bundled the most important herbs in May's apron and tied it securely. May could hang it around her neck, keeping her hands free to help Neka. The basket they would have to leave behind. As they approached the water's edge, May felt her heart beating faster. The ford was about 30 paces across at its narrowest point. The water would reach their knees in some places, maybe higher. For someone with 2 good legs, it was a challenging but manageable crossing. For Neka, with her injured ankle, May pushed the doubt away. They would make it. They had to. She positioned herself on Neka's injured side, slipping her arm around the girl's waist. Neka leaned on both May and the walking stick, testing her balance. After a few practice steps along the shore, she nodded that she was ready. The first step into the river sent a shock of cold up May's legs. The water was colder than it looked, fed by mountain springs. Beside her, she heard Neka's sharp intake of breath, but the native girl didn't hesitate. Together, they took another step and another, moving slowly into the current. The riverbed stones were smooth and slick beneath their feet. May felt her way carefully, testing each step before putting her weight down. The water swirled around their ankles, then their calves, pushing against them like invisible hands trying to knock them off balance. Halfway across, the river deepened. The water rose to their knees and the current grew stronger. May's muscles strained as she fought to stay upright while supporting Neka. The bundle of herbs bounced against her chest with every step. Almost halfway, May said, her voice nearly lost in the rush of water. "You're doing well." Neka couldn't understand the words, but she seemed to take comfort in May's voice. She replied with a few words of her own, her tone determined despite the pain that must have been shooting through her injured ankle. 3/4 of the way across, disaster struck. Neka's walking stick slipped on a moss-covered stone, throwing her off balance. She lurched sideways, nearly pulling both of them into the deeper channel to their left. May staggered, fighting to keep them upright as the current pushed at her legs. For one terrifying moment, May thought they would fall. The river would sweep them downstream, away from the ford and into deeper, faster water. Neither of them was strong enough to swim against that current. But then Neka's free hand shot out, finding purchase on a large boulder that jutted from the water. She steadied herself, giving May time to regain her footing. Their eyes met, wide with the shared understanding of how close they'd come to being swept away. "Thank you," May gasped, even knowing Neka wouldn't understand. The native girl responded with a grim smile and a nod. They stood for a moment, catching their breath, then continued their careful progress across the river. When they finally reached the far bank, both girls collapsed onto the rocky shore, breathing hard. May's legs trembled with exhaustion, and her dress was soaked to the waist. Beside her, Neka examined her bandaged ankle, which had started bleeding again, a red stain spreading through the cloth. May untied her bundle of herbs and found the river root. She made a fresh poultice and re-bandaged Neka's wound as best she could with her remaining cloth strips. The native girl watched her work, her face a mask that hid whatever pain she felt. As May finished tying the bandage, she suddenly realized where they were, on tribal land, where no settler was supposed to set foot. She glanced around nervously, half expecting warriors to emerge from the trees at any moment. Neka touched her arm, drawing her attention. The native girl pointed to the darkening sky, then to the forest, and finally to herself. She made a sleeping gesture, then pointed back toward the river and the settlement beyond. May understood. Neka was saying she should return home before nightfall, but the thought of crossing the river again alone in the gathering dusk made May's stomach twist with fear. The current had been strong enough with 2 of them bracing each other. Alone in failing light, She shook her head and pointed to the sky, then made a rising sun motion with her hand. "I'll go back in the morning." Neka's expression changed to one of concern. She spoke rapidly, gesturing toward the forest and then to the river several times. May couldn't understand the words, but the message seemed clear enough. It wasn't safe for a settler girl to stay on tribal lands overnight. But what choice did they have? The river was too dangerous to cross now, with the light fading and both of them exhausted, and Nika still needed help to reach her village. May made up her mind. She pointed to Nika, then to herself, then toward the forest. "I'll help you get home." Nika studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to understand why this settler girl would risk so much to help her. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she finally nodded and pointed to a faint trail leading into the trees. They helped each other stand, both stiff from their brief rest. With Neka leaning on her walking stick and May close beside her for support, they moved away from the river and into the forest. The trees here were older, taller than those on the settlement side, with broader trunks and fuller canopies. The underbrush was thinner too, as if these woods had been carefully tended over many generations. As the river sounds faded behind them, replaced by the evening calls of birds and the whisper of wind through leaves, May felt a strange mixture of fear and wonder. No settler child had walked these paths in living memory. What would her parents think if they could see her now? The thought gave her pause, but only for a moment. They had taught her to be kind, to help those in need. Surely that mattered more than invisible lines drawn between peoples who shared the same land. With that thought giving her courage, May walked deeper into the tribal forest, helping a girl she couldn't speak to but somehow understood all the same. The forest grew darker as May and Neka made their slow progress along the narrow trail. Tall pines towered overhead, their branches filtering the fading daylight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds called their evening songs, and somewhere in the distance, a fox barked. Neka moved with growing difficulty. Though the walking stick helped, each step clearly pained her. The fresh bandage on her ankle had already darkened with blood, and her face had taken on a grayish tinge beneath her copper skin. Still, she pressed forward, her jaw set with determination. May wondered how much farther they had to go. She wanted to ask, but the language barrier made it impossible. Instead, she stayed close to Neka's side, offering support whenever the path grew steeper or rougher. After about an hour of slow walking, Neka suddenly stopped, her head tilted as if listening. May froze beside her, straining her ears. At first she heard nothing beyond the usual forest sounds. Then she caught it, the faint sound of running water, different from the river they'd left behind. Neka gestured toward the sound, speaking a few words in her language. She pointed to the sky, where the first stars were appearing, then made a sleeping motion with her hands pressed together beside her tilted head. May understood. They wouldn't reach Neka's village before full dark. They needed to find shelter for the night, and Neka was suggesting the place near the water. Together, they turned off the main path onto a fainter trail that wound between moss-covered boulders. The sound of water grew louder, and soon they emerged into a small clearing beside a brook. The water bubbled over rocks, creating a soothing melody in the gathering dusk. Near the brook stood the remains of an old hunting shelter, a simple lean-to made of branches and bark, partially collapsed but still offering some protection. Neka smiled at the sight of it, speaking a word that sounded like Nayeli and pointing to herself. "You built this?" May asked, mimicking the construction with her hands. Neka nodded, then held her hand at waist height and spoke again. May guessed she meant she had built it when she was younger, perhaps during previous hunting trips to this area. With the last of the daylight fading fast, they worked together to repair the shelter. May gathered fallen branches while Neka, seated on a flat rock to rest her ankle, wove them into the existing structure. Despite her injury, Neka's fingers moved with practiced skill, showing May how to overlap the branches for strength and how to layer the bark to keep out rain. As darkness settled fully over the forest, their shelter was complete, small but sturdy enough to protect them through the night. Neka showed May how to gather soft pine boughs for bedding, and together they created a comfortable floor inside the lean-to. May's stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since midday. Neka gave a soft laugh, The first time May had heard her laugh, and reached into a small pouch at her waist. She pulled out what looked like strips of dried meat and a handful of berries, offering them to May. May accepted gratefully. The meat was tougher than she was used to, with a smoky, gamey flavor, but her hunger made it taste wonderful. The berries were sweet and burst with juice in her mouth. She shared her own meager provisions, half an apple and a chunk of cheese from her morning's work. As they ate, sitting cross-legged at the entrance to their shelter, Neka began to speak. Though May couldn't understand the words, she found herself caught up in the rhythm of the girl's voice. Neka pointed to herself, then to the forest, then made a sweeping gesture that seemed to encompass everything around them. She spoke with pride and love, that much was clear. When she finished, she looked at May expectantly. May realized she was being asked to share something of herself in return. Despite the language barrier, they were having a conversation of sorts. So May began to talk, pointing to herself and then in the direction of the settlement. She mimed her parents' deaths with closed eyes and a solemn face, then showed how she lived alone now. She described her daily life with gestures, mending clothes, tending her garden, gathering herbs in the forest. Neka watched intently, her dark eyes missing nothing. When May finished, Neka reached out and touched her hand briefly. The gesture needed no translation. It was comfort, understanding, shared humanity. They built a small fire outside the shelter, just enough to provide warmth without attracting unwanted attention from predators or other people. The dancing flames cast flickering shadows across their faces as they continued their wordless conversation, learning about each other through gestures and expressions. May learned that Neka was the daughter of an important man in her tribe, perhaps a chief or medicine person. She gathered this from the way Neka straightened her posture when speaking of him, touching the beaded necklace at her throat with reverence. She learned that Neka had been separated from a hunting party when she fell and injured her ankle, and that she had been trying to find her way home for several days. In turn, May shared more about herself, how she knew the forest plants and their uses, how she traded her knowledge for food and supplies in the settlement. She showed Neka her honey-colored stone, explaining through gestures that it was her father's last gift to her. Neka nodded in understanding. She slipped her own necklace over her head and held it out for May to see. The polished stones caught the firelight, glowing with inner warmth. Each one, Neka explained through gestures, had been given to her by a family member on important occasions. The largest, a deep blue stone veined with white, had been her grandmother's gift when Neka first became a woman. As the night deepened around them, May felt a strange peace settle over her. Here she was, far from everything familiar, in territory she had been warned all her life to avoid, sitting beside a girl whose language she couldn't speak. Yet somehow she felt more connected, more understood than she had since her parents died. The fire burned lower, and Neka yawned. The day's exertions had clearly taken their toll, and her injured ankle needed rest. May banked the fire carefully, the way her father had taught her, leaving just enough embers to keep some warmth through the night without risking a forest fire. They crawled into their shelter, settling onto the soft pine boughs. The small space held their combined body heat, creating a pocket of warmth against the cool autumn night. Through gaps in the shelter's roof, May could see stars scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on dark cloth. "Good night, Neka," she whispered. Beside her, Neka murmured something that sounded like a similar sentiment in her own language. Sleep came quickly to both girls, exhausted as they were from their river crossing and forest journey. May dreamed of her parents not as they were in their final illness but as they had been in life, strong, loving, full of laughter. In her dream, they stood with her at the edge of a great forest, pointing toward something she couldn't quite see. She woke suddenly in the pre-dawn darkness, unsure what had disturbed her sleep. Beside her, Neka still slumbered, her breathing deep and even. May lay still, listening. There, a soft footfall outside their shelter, the crack of a twig, the whisper of fabric against leaves. Someone was out there. No, not someone. Several someones moving with practiced stealth through the forest. May's heart hammered against her ribs. Had they been found by Nika's people? Or worse, had settlers from Willow Creek tracked them across the river? Either possibility filled her with dread. She touched Nika's shoulder gently. The native girl woke instantly, her eyes flying open without the slightest disorientation. May pressed a finger to her lips, then pointed to the shelter entrance. Nika tilted her head, listening, and her expression changed from confusion to recognition. She whispered a single word, so low May barely heard it. The look on her face wasn't fear, it was relief. Moving carefully to avoid putting weight on her injured ankle, Nika crawled to the entrance of their shelter and peered out into the darkness. May followed, her heart still racing. The eastern sky had just begun to lighten, turning from black to deepest blue. In that faint light, May saw them, shadowy figures moving among the trees. Men in deerskin clothing with feathers in their long hair and bows slung across their backs. Warriors from Nika's tribe. Nika called out, her voice strong and clear in the dawn stillness. The figures stopped, then moved quickly toward the shelter. May shrank back, suddenly very aware that she was a settler child deep in tribal territory. Nika spoke rapidly to the approaching warriors, gesturing to her bandaged ankle and then to May. The men's faces remained impassive, but their eyes, sharp as hawks, took in everything. One man stepped forward, taller than the others, with gray streaks in his long black hair and a necklace of bear claws around his neck. He spoke directly to Nika, his voice deep and resonant in the quiet forest. May didn't need to understand the words to know this was someone of importance. The way the other warriors deferred to him, the way Nika straightened her posture despite her pain. This man held power. Nika responded respectfully but firmly, occasionally gesturing toward May. She seemed to be explaining what had happened, defending May's presence in tribal lands. The man listened without interruption, his weathered face giving away nothing of his thoughts. When Nika finished, he turned his gaze to May, studying her with eyes that missed nothing. May fought the urge to look away. Instead, she met his gaze steadily, the way her father had taught her when dealing with adults. Show respect, but not fear.